To let our workloads in our cluster use SPIFFE and fetch identities, we'll have to register them first. And before even registering our workloads, we'll have to register our nodes to the SPIRE so that SPIRE server can have an idea of what kind of a cluster we have and can query our cluster and do its magic essentially. And while there are tools like Kubernetes Workload Registrar or SPIRE Controller Manager to automate the generation and federation of these identities, I'll do the identity registration steps manually on the command line here to show you how the overall process works behind the scenes. So instead of typing everything from scratch, again, I copied a bunch of scripts and they are inside the SPIRE folder in our workspace. So I'll walk through the relevant ones as we use them when the time comes. In order for any SPIRE server to talk with the pods on a node, we'll have to register the node first. And here's how you can do it with the SPIRE server API. This command tells us what kind of service account token the server expects from the SPIRE agent. And in our case, we expect our agent to be inside cluster 3 cluster under the SPIRE namespace using this SPIRE agent service account. So anything that does not match this spec cannot claim to be a SPIRE agent to the server. We also give our node a unique SPIFFE ID that will be used to cryptographically identify the node when we need it. And finally, we append this -node flag to identify that we are registering a node and not a workload. Okay, so let's register our node by running this register node sh. Here's our SPIRE node registration entry details. Now let's look into how we can register workloads. We'll start with the client application. So our greeter client app has a unique SPIFFE ID for it, and our client is under this cluster 3 demo trust domain. And to identify itself, it should live in the default namespace under this default service account with a label named app greeter client. And before I forget, I'll add a note here for a later video. If we want to federate the client or any workload for that matter, we need to identify how and where it federates with during its registration. Since we are not doing federation right now, we don't have to worry about it, but I'm just putting it as a pointer so I don't forget when the time comes to implement it. Let's create a registration entry for our client by executing register client sh. And for the greeter server, it's similar. Our server is under cluster 3 demo trust domain. It has to be in this default namespace using a default service account. Let's create the registration entry for the server by executing register server.sh. So when I show entries, we can see 3 entries here. One for the node, one for server, and one for client. So far, so good. Let me register the node on the other cluster that we have, which is cluster 004. So it's a similar registration. The only difference is instead of the cluster 3.demo trust domain, we'll be using cluster 4 demo. And cluster 4 will be our name of the cluster as well, instead of cluster 3. And let's execute register node. And voila, we have a node entry created as well. So whenever we want to add a workload, we can create a registration entry for that workload here too, so that the workload can start getting SVIDs from the SPIRE agent using the workload API. Next up, we'll tie the loose ends and update the server and client code to use SVIDs and security bundles that the SPIRE agent distributes using the workload API, and we'll let them authenticate themselves and establish a secure MTLS or mutual transport layer security connection using the SPIRE workload API. Curious? Let's see how we are going to do this on the next video.